Welcome to Higher Change. We're on moral leadership. This is about power and ethical persuasion. Effective leadership seeks to help and serve others rather than ourselves and requires the ability to stand out and be different. This helps to instill trust and encourages people to follow those leaders. So in this lesson, we're going to describe how the bystander effect relates to leadership. We'll also describe how self-differentiation and integrity are important. We'll differentiate an external versus an internal locus of control. We'll also differentiate persuasion versus relying on authority to gain obedience. We'll identify the benefits of central versus peripheral paths in the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion and which is more effective in the long run. We'll also describe the use of cognitive dissonance in motivating change. We'll differentiate power and influence versus dominance and control. We'll identify which form of power is more effective in the long run. And we'll differentiate control and compliance versus unity and diversity. And then lastly, we'll describe servant leadership as an approach to leadership. So let's talk about how the bystander effect relates to leadership. As you recall, when we talked about the bystander effect, the reason why people don't do anything is because there's this diffusion of responsibility that occurs when a person fails to take responsibility for actions or for inaction because of the presence of other people who could share the responsibility. And that's why people oftentimes don't do anything when somebody's in need of help. But you may also recall that it only takes one person who is willing to stand out and be different. If one person decided to intervene and help somebody, then other people are more likely to follow. So what are the implications of this for leadership? It really raises the importance of how leaders who are willing to be different can make a difference on other people. The question, though, is how do we attain that when we are under so much pressure to conform to other people? How do we go against the grain? Another thing is that leadership is not about having a title, but it's about whether we influence others or not. So many people who have titles are people pleasers, and they're not able to go against the grain because it depends so much on the applause or the approval of the other people around them. And so when that's the case, they don't really have a spine. They can't really go against the grain because it depends so much on other people's approval. It reminds me of the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 that demonstrated that he demonstrated leadership because he was willing to do something different in helping a victim when other leaders were passing by. They were religious leaders. And this really is kind of a good illustration of leadership because people you would think are leaders aren't really leaders. The one who is willing to go against the grain and help somebody demonstrates real leadership because he's looking at who is his real neighbor. He's thinking about serving other people besides himself. So that brings us to the importance of differentiation and integrity. Integrity demonstrates that a leader can be trusted to follow. It reminds me of a story about somebody who was applying to be a CFO or a chief financial officer for an organization. And prior to this interview, he was going through line and he decided to, swipe some condiments or something that he thought was really small. And when he got to the interview, he discovered that the person who was interviewing was one who was standing behind him in the cafeteria line. And he said, because you did that, how do we trust you with a large amount of money? And it reminds me that there's a passage in the Bible that says, it talks about those who are faithful in the small things can be trusted with the bigger things. So integrity is about being consistent with one's own higher values. It comes from the word integration because we're integrating all parts of ourselves. We're not ignoring a part of ourselves. We're not ignoring our conscience. We're living consistently and we have intentionality. Unfortunately, some people don't feel like they should be accountable to other people. And that leads to an autocracy. Autocracy is where people feel like they shouldn't have any accountability. And organizations where there's no accountability oftentimes lead to a corruption with no integrity. So having some accountability is important for integrity. Now, drawing on family systems theory, Edwin Friedman writes that leaders need to be a non-anxious presence among people. That's because leaders are often triangulated into conflict. If you have a problem with somebody, oftentimes people go to the boss or the person in charge or the most visible leader because they want to get that person on their side and gang up on the other person that they're having conflict with. And unfortunately, this happens a lot in organizations. Oftentimes people go to their pastor or their boss or somebody who has visible power to help them in their conflict with other people. Now, it reminds me in Matthew 18, Jesus instructs us that if you have a problem, go to the person directly. And then if that doesn't work, then you bring in somebody else. But you don't bring in somebody else until you've at least dealt with the problem directly, the person directly. Now, people who are not differentiated in their own selves, they often take on the anxiety of the people around them. They oftentimes become lightning rods of dissent or of conflict in an organization. People who are non-anxious are able to have peace in the storm. When other people are anxious or when there's conflict going on around them, they're able to differentiate themselves and maintain a sense of peace, and they don't absorb the negativity of the people around them. And that's what leadership does. It helps to maintain the tone and regulate the emotions in the organization. Now, leaders also need to look at their locus of control. Locus of control is who has power in your life. And so let's take a look at that. There's the external locus of control. These are people who have a victim mindset. People who have a victim mindset have an external locus of control because they're basically passive recipients of their circumstances. People outside of themselves control them. On the other hand, a leader mindset is somebody who has an internal locus of control. These people believe that they are responsible for themselves and that they have power over their own lives. So someone with an external locus of control adopts a victim mindset, where they are passive recipients of external circumstances that are out of their control. Oftentimes, these are people who are in survival mode, maybe because perhaps they were victims, and so they're just trying to survive. And on the other hand, their leaders have an internal locus of control. And it's not to say that victims can't be leaders. It's just talking about a mindset. A victim mindset is somebody who has a mindset that they are simply victims. On the other hand, people who rise above their circumstances take on that leadership mindset. And these are people who have an internal locus of control, that no matter what happens to them in the external environment, they can still control themselves, or at least their response to the situations. They may not have control over the circumstance, but they have control. They take personal responsibility for how they respond to those external challenges. And they believe they can make a difference in their environment at least. They may not control the environment. They believe they can at least make a difference. And they're willing to make personal sacrifices for the things that they believe in. Now, leaders also want to change people's attitudes. That's what leadership is involving, right? You're leading people. But how do we change other people's attitudes and beliefs? Well, first of all, attitudes drive our behavior. If we want to change people's behaviors, we need to change our attitudes. So the question is, of course, how do we change those attitudes? One way, of course, is through compliance and using authority. So compliance, or the changing of one's behavior at the command of an authority figure, is called obedience. So you can just simply demand that people will change their beliefs. However, how effective is that? The reality is that you might force somebody to change their beliefs, but have they really changed anything? It hasn't really changed their internal thoughts. So that really brings us to the difference between persuasion versus obedience to authority. What is persuasion? Persuasion is the attempt to change the attitudes of another person through argument, pleading, or explanation. Attitudes consist of beliefs, opinions, positions, or course of action. So key elements in persuasion often include the sources of the message. Obviously, credibility helps. The message itself. The target audience, of course, plays a role. You have to have an alignment between your message and the audience. And lastly, the medium. Some people have said the medium is the message. How you communicate can also be very important. Now, the elaboration likelihood model helps us to understand principles of persuasion and what's most effective. The elaboration likelihood model, ELM, examines how likely it is that an individual will elaborate on or think about persuasive message and what the outcome of the elaboration will most likely be. What they found is that the more you have to thoughtfully consider something, the more lasting the change will be. If you're simply reacting on an emotional level or because it's been conditioned, you might have a temporary change, but the more you actually have to think about something and really reason about it, the lasting that change could be. Now, there are two different paths. There's the central path and there's the peripheral path. The central path, if you're thinking about like buying a car, a central path would encourage you to think about its cost, the insurance cost, the safety ratings, the reliability, the reviews, and the fuel efficiency. However, if you're basing a decision on the peripheral path, you're going to look at things like the color, pictures of fluffy dice, the speed you can drive at, the sex appeal. For example, many advertisements of cars in the past would use women in bikinis. Well, how relevant is that to the car? It's not. But people have used that to sell cars. People oftentimes look at how expensive it is. They want to have something that's more expensive than their neighbor. So that's because it demonstrates status. And even the size of the wheels might be interesting because people want to feel powerful or look like they're powerful. But how much do these things actually affect the quality of the car? Not really, but people like to buy the experience too, the package, the emotional experience that goes along with it. So the central path involves attending to the content of the message itself, while the peripheral path involves attending to factors that are not involved in the message, such as the appearance of the source of the message, or the source, so the packaging, and also the length of the message, things like that. Those are the kinds of things that people are going to pay attention to. How it's packaged. So when people attend to the content, the model describes it as essential route processing. When people pay attention to the information or factors outside of the message itself, this is referred to as peripheral route processing. It's peripheral to the real issues. Now, another way that people can be persuaded to change something or change an attitude is when they realize that there's some cognitive dissonance. What is cognitive dissonance? Cognitive dissonance is a psychological discomfort that occurs when a person's behavior does not match up with that person's attitudes. So, for example, if somebody asks you, "Have you ever lied?" and you say, "Of course not." But in your mind, you're thinking, "Oh, yeah, that's a lie." Well, that will be cognitive dissonance because your behavior is not in alignment with what you profess. The actions are different from the belief you profess. This is cognitive dissonance. Your explicit goals are different from your implicit motives, as you may recall. So the discomfort is typically resolved by either changing the conflicting behavior, changing the conflicting attitude, or forming a new attitude to justify the behavior. And that sometimes happens too. But either way, change occurs because of the conflict, the cognitive dissonance that arises in your mind. A motivational interviewing is a counseling method based on the theory that change happens as a result of creating cognitive dissonance through highlighting how implicit motives conflict with explicit goals. So if you're a counselor and you want to help people change their actions, you might simply help them to face some of their explicit beliefs and look at how much in alignment their behaviors are, and look at some of the implicit motives that might be driving their behaviors to be different from what they profess. So, for example, someone might say, "Well, I'm not racist," but then they are discriminating against people without really being aware of it. Well, motivational interviewing might help raise awareness about the gap between what they say and what they do. Now, that really brings us back to the issue of persuasion versus obedience. Persuasion might appeal to these things because they're trying to appeal to people's reason rather than just demanding people change. So as children are growing up, oftentimes early on, parents will rely on the authority that they have. For example, if a child says, "But why?" the parent might say, "Because I said so." But if they use that when the child gets older, then an older child may come to resent it because they want to be treated more with respect. They want to understand why there are rules. So as the children grow older, parents must learn to shift their method of influence from authority that demands obedience to relying on persuasion, especially when those children become adult children or adults. Otherwise, the children may come to resent it and rebel when they have more freedom. If you want them to change on a more lasting level, then you need to get them to buy into that change, and that's only done through persuasion. The Bible seems to describe also a shift away from a God as an authoritarian figure to one who seems to persuade us as if we are equals. The Bible says in the Bible, Isaiah 1:18, God says, "Come now, let us reason together." If even God could want to reason with us, and rather than demanding us simply just obey because he's an authority, how much more should we also try to use persuasion and reasoning? It also brings us to the difference between power and influence versus dominance and control. And what's the difference between the two? So first of all, unfortunately, a lot of times people will rely on abusive power to control people. So I want to look at some methods or things that people do. One is that they might intimidate another person. So this is the wheel of power that's used to describe domestic violence. And so some people might try to use intimidation, like a man might try to intimidate his partner. Then they might use emotional abuse, and this is when they make the other person feel bad or demean them. Economic abuse is basically financial exploitation, where they might withdraw or withhold money from the other person so that they can't go anywhere. Then there's isolation. Keeping people from their friends or their social support is one way of controlling people. Then there's minimizing and denying facts or denying what they've done. And this is kind of like gaslighting somebody. It's making them second guess themselves. It's another way of controlling people. Then some people will use their children or pets as pawns. They might say, if you want to see your kids again, then you have to do it my way. And so that would be using children as a pawn. Using privilege. This is, oftentimes the case for men where they might say something like, well, I'm the head of the family, so you have to do it my way. So that would be using privilege. And lastly, coercion and threats. Basically threatening to hurt somebody or even a veiled threat that could keep people in line. Now, all of these basically devalue people and put them as in a less than position. Whereas the opposite of this would be empowering people and giving them a sense of equality. So let's talk about the wheel of equal power. And so what are some things that help maintain or encourage people to have equality in their relationship? There's emotional intimacy. And so emotional intimacy and vulnerability actually allows the other person to know what's going on and actually enables the other person to be an equal. Then there's quality time and affection. If you want to have equality in a good, healthy relationship, you have to be able to spend time with people, quality time, and that helps you to see the value in the other person. And then respect. So obviously mutual respect is important. Then there's trust. In an equal relationship, there's trust from both sides rather than jealousy or insecurity. And then there's open communication and economic partnership. Economic partnership is rather than somebody exploiting the other or dictating how the money's spent, they decide together and they work on their budgets together. So that one person is not the financial gatekeeper. Rather, both partners are working together to decide on how money is spent. Then there's social support. So rather than isolating somebody, they allow the other person to have a social support. And then accountability. They hold themselves accountable to other people and their partner. So rather than saying, well, I don't need to tell you where I went, they allow the other person to check on them because it's one way of ensuring trust. And they don't mind being held accountable for their behavior. And shared responsibilities is another feature of equal relationships because rather than one person doing all the work or one person doing all the parenting, both partners share in household work or in parenting responsibilities. And lastly, they use negotiation to attain a sense of fairness in the relationship. So both partners feel a sense that they're able to equally negotiate to get their needs met so that they can feel that things are fair. And this ensures that partners are equal in a relationship. And I would say these same things also apply to organizations as well. You know, in organizations where there is a sense that everybody is an equal, you will see similar things. Otherwise, in organizations where one person is abusing other people, you will not find these as much. So let's talk about the difference again between dominance and power. Dominance is about outward control, while power is about the ability to influence people. Now, how do you influence people, though? It has to go deeper than something that's superficial. A man may be able to coerce a woman into doing something that she doesn't want to do. That would be dominance. Or maybe even worse, it might be assault. But that does not mean he's changed her heart, because that's what really power is about, the ability to influence people. Now, there may be some blurring between the two. You know, maybe people might have Stockholm syndrome, for example, if they're held against their will, and then their heart might change. But that's very rare. Ultimately, more often than not, the more people try to control somebody, the more it drives the other person away. So what is the most effective kind of power? Dominance and control? Or is it relational power? What I found in my research is that only relational power and emotional avoidance are correlated with satisfaction outcomes for couples. So it really says that love, honestly, is the most powerful force in relationships. So let's talk about relational power. This is really what I was saying, that love is power. And it reminds me of this quote by Ellen White. She says something I think is really powerful. She says, "Love is power. Intellectual and moral strength are involved in this principle and cannot be separated from it. The power of wealth has a tendency to corrupt and destroy." It's interesting, as I was talking about, if you try to rely on power, the power of wealth, oftentimes it corrupts people. The power of force is strong to do hurt. You might just make people feel like they've been assaulted. But the excellence and value of pure love consists in its efficiency to do good and to do nothing else than good. People who love their partners are more likely to have influence. And it's not just in marriages. I'm thinking about, like, for example, when I had to share a house with my sister when I was in college. And I remember my sister really wanted to change the curtains. She wanted to put pink curtains up that somebody gave us. And I didn't like pink. So I said, "Hey, it's my house too. I don't want pink in the house." And so I might try to assert myself. But the more I try to assert myself, the more she felt hurt that I didn't care. And so eventually I said, "Okay, fine. If you want to have the pink curtains up, go ahead. I just want you to be happy." And I remember that she cried and she said, I really appreciate knowing that you care. You want what I want. And because of that, I don't really want it anymore. And so she ultimately deferred to me, but not because I demanded my way, but because we just saw that we loved each other as brother and sister. And that was more important. So really, love is power. It has more. I also think about this allegory that people have sometimes shared. There was a man outside who was wearing a jacket, and the rain would try to rain really hard down on the person, and he didn't want to take his jacket off. And then the wind would try and would blow and blow and blow on this man, but the guy didn't want to take his jacket off. But the sun came out and just simply radiated its sunshine, and the man took his jacket off. In the same way, the more you try to force somebody to do something, like I said, oftentimes it won't work. But when people know that they're loved, they're more likely to respond in a positive way. So that's the difference between power and influence, real power, which is oftentimes more relational, and dominance and control. But let's talk about conformity and compliance versus unity and diversity, which is very similar. You can demand conformity, but have you really attained unity? You might just silence dissent, but that's nothing. So unity or conformity is really about an outward compliance and getting people to be similar on the outside. But it hasn't really changed people's heart. Unity, on the other hand, actually it has some flexibility for diversity of styles of people, and so unity oftentimes is in diversity, but unity is more at the heart level. Rather than expecting people to conform on the outside, they are united in principle and harmonized on the love that they have for each other. And that's really what unity is about. It goes a lot deeper than conformity. So conformity emphasizes harmony based on coerced similarity behavior, while unity emphasizes harmony based on love and interpersonal relationships. That leads us to the subject of cults. As you recall from our previous lesson, cults are about getting people to conform, and it relies on abuse of power and control to keep people in the cult. Now, this has implications for leadership. So let's take a look at this. As you recall, cults have common features. People in it feign love or care for your well-being until you want to leave. They may foster dependency on the group or on the charismatic leader or authority who's always right. And the dependency can be for feeling loved, morality, because you're never good enough, money, sex, or drugs. All these things can exploit people and keep them dependent on the cult. Then they often have charismatic, narcissistic leaders who have very little accountability. The dependency allows members to be exploited, whether financially or sexually, and the cults may even normalize sexually abusive behavior. They also have an atmosphere of intolerance of critical questions, which ultimately foster groupthink. They use shame or fear to prevent exiting, and leaving the cult can be very difficult. Loyalty is to the group rather than to one's higher principles. So oftentimes a loyalty to the group can cause them to sacrifice their principles because they think that is more important. And lastly, entrance into the cult may involve coercive indoctrination or re-education, rather than simply allowing people to use what they already know. Now, all of these things, as I said, require or involve an element of control. But what would it look like if it was the opposite of this? What is the opposite of a cult, and what do they look like? So that brings us to what I want to share with you now, which is the history of the cult. Helps us understand what's the opposite of that. In the Bible actually shares this history of a cult, the one cult that probably drives all other cults. And it's interesting that in the Bible, it actually has from the beginning, the first book, Genesis, all the way to the very end, the last book of the Bible, which is the book of Revelation. It all shares a story about a cult. And it's interesting because we usually think about the Bible as a story of God, right? But it's also the story of a cult. So let's talk about that. In the beginning, in Genesis 11, the story shares about the Tower of Babel. As you may recall, after the flood, the people wanted to build a tower to protect themselves. And so they built this tower to the heavens. And so it was called, and yet it was called Babel. Interestingly, it says, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And so the Babel sounds like babbling. That's where we might get that word from, babbling. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. So, we know from the story that the Tower of Babel was interrupted. However, it didn't go away. And so, according to the story in Genesis 10, Nimrod founded the Assyrian kingdom on the ruins of Babel, which is also known as Babylon. Babylon is the Greek for Babel. And so this is what Genesis 10 says. Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babel or Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, or the Akkadians, Calneh, and Shinar, which is where I believe Babylon came to be, or near Iraq, basically. Babel actually means the gates of God. That's relevant to the subject of cults because that's what cults really are. They think that they are the gate of God. They are often, especially in the case of religious cults, they control access to God. And so it's really a man-made system. And they are they're trying to create a sense of security in their own salvation. And as I said, Babel is the same word for Babylon. Babylon is Greek for Babel. Now going back, that was in the book of Genesis, but if we skip all the way to the end in the book of Revelation, we also see the same cult. In Revelation 17, it describes this woman. If you look at it, it says, I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup up in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore the testimony to Jesus. So here we see Babylon again. It was all the way back in the beginning in Genesis and all the way to the end of the book. The same cult spans the history of this earth, essentially, according to the Bible. And this book of Revelation provides a warning for people. It says, the angels came with a mighty voice and shouted, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. And if you think about fallen, essentially it sounds like that Tower of Babel falling. And that's why we should get out of it. So it says, the angel says, she has become a dwelling for demons, for all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. So this is a cult that has a lot of power, spans the world, and it causes them to do things that they shouldn't do. So that's why this warning says, come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive of any of her plagues. And that's because we are ultimately responsible for our behavior. And if we belong to something like that, then we may be held responsible for the actions of that cult. So I'm using this because I want to contrast between the cult on the right and a healthy system that is on the left. And the Revelation also describes another woman. A woman is used to describe a church. In the case of the bride is representing the church of God, whereas the husband is God. And so we see that metaphor. The woman represents the church of God. But here's another woman. This says in Revelation 12, it says, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. And some people think this refers to Mary because Mary was the mother of Jesus. However, it could also refer to the church. And that's what it has a bigger meaning than just Mary. It really means this is really referring to the church, but not just any church. We're talking about something that's different because the other one, Babylon, was also a religious group. So what's different about this group? Let's look at the differences between the closed system and the open system. The religious cult, or Babylon, in this system, salvation is from the group or the leader. It creates dependency on the group. They must work to please holy people. They use guilt and shame to trap people. It exploits and it takes advantage of people. It motivates people with the fear of hell. Leaders use authority to serve their own needs. They attract people with beauty and charisma, and it provides a sense of certainty and security. That's what people are looking for. That's why they are drawn to that. On the other hand, in an open system, salvation is not from people, it's from God only. We put our trust in a secure relationship with God, not with people. We accept people where they are. We're not the heroes. God is. And it encourages us to free people from their guilt and shame rather than trapping people with guilt and shame. It also respects people's free choice. So they're able to leave if they want, and we respect them. And rather than motivating people with fear, we inspire people with love. And that's because leaders are setting an example. They're serving others to empower others. They're not out to fulfill their own needs. They're out to help other people. They see their role as servants. And they attract people with humility and love rather than external beauty and charisma. There is a genuineness here. And lastly, they may face opposition, but they ultimately survive in the long run. And that's because the open system is more enduring in the long run. The cults may have temporary attraction, but they're ultimately death-oriented, and they're very destructive. So let's talk about what healthy leaders do. And this is what I'd like to talk about with regards to servant leadership. Servant leadership is a model of leadership that posits that the primary purpose of an effective leader is to serve others. This is in contrast to the typical cult leader that uses charm and coercion to influence people. And this was first taught by Jesus Christ, who really modeled servant leadership. He came to serve. And so leading through service is servant leadership. That's what servant leadership is, leading people by serving them. This is the picture by James Tissot. This is called Christ washing the disciples' feet. And this is depicting the scene where Jesus got down on his knees and washed the feet of his disciples. They all expected a lowly servant to do it, and they're all waiting for someone to come along and do it. But he got down and modeled service for other people. So while everybody else was waiting for someone else to do it, he did it. And that's what a servant does. And he says, so the last will be first, and the first will be last. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. So the rulers of the Gentiles, they use dominant strategies. They try to control people and assert their power. And their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. I think this is a really key text. He says that we should be different. It shouldn't be about domination and control. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many. The God of the universe didn't come to demand that we simply submit and follow him. He didn't simply assert his way and seek to control us as if we were robots. Instead, he came to serve us and woo us and persuade us using reasoning. Christians often look to this example of Jesus Christ as a model of service. This is what Paul writes in Philippians 2 about Jesus. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, which is really what narcissistic leaders are oftentimes doing. They're doing it out of their own ambition or their own narcissism. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. And that's a philosophy I like to uphold. I want to appreciate the people around me as valuable, not looking to our own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And this is what he writes. Who, being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And so, yes, he did obey, but not because of somebody telling, but because he loved us. He wanted to serve us. And that's what it means to serve people, because we do so out of our compassion and love for people. And, interestingly, even though we might think he ended up in a lower position, Philippians 2 says, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name. Talk about effective leadership. If you really want to be raised to that higher place, it starts by going lower. And the more we serve others, the more trust it instills in other people, and the more they want to give us leadership. Robert Greenleaf proposed two aspects of this servant leadership mindset. He says, I serve because I am the leader. And that's what leaders do. We serve. And I am the leader because I serve. That's because when we serve others, it creates that trust. And people want to follow. And therefore, we are leaders because of our service. So I really think that's a model of leadership that I like to uphold, and I'd like to teach others that as well, because that's more effective. It's not just about moralizing here, but it's also looking at what is the most effective strategy for being a leader. And that really brings us back to that point that love is power. When we love people, that is the most powerful thing we can do, and it has the power to change hearts and transform people. So that brings us to the next subject. What is love? And we're going to talk about interpersonal romantic relationships, and I hope you can join me for that as well. Thank you.